Hello again, and welcome to the Babies in Common show. This is part 2 of our episode with Arlene Lammy, doula and storyteller, birth and postpartum doula. And episode 63 was chock full of some great stories from her and her background. So I hope you have time to listen to that. But we're going to focus a little bit more on some other things today. So here we go, episode 64 with Arlene Lammy.
I know you've been quoted in the past by saying you, quote, crave changing the stigma of birth and the narrative of the fourth trimester. And I just love this quote. And I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit on what you mean by, changing the narrative of the fourth trimester, right?
Yeah, I think, first of all, that it's called the fourth trimester, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, as a person who is a former teacher, like trimester, it just feels like a medical term in some ways and feels like a finite amount of time or a set of weeks, right? And so I remember very confidently feeling like when I became a doula, at first I thought I would just be a postpartum doula. And that was kind of like my thing, that I was like, I've already been a postpartum expert. I've been doing this for a while. And realizing that, of course, postpartum goes beyond the fourth trimester and the first 12 weeks. And that really postpartum is forever. Keep our babies.
Oh God, girl, preach. I might always say.
That's why 20 years later we go, oh, it's my postpartum body.
Yeah.
Right. No, I've had a couple of friends be like, is a postpartum doula appropriate at 48 months? We could talk about it. I love your toddlers. We could talk about it. Right? But it's forever. Postpartum is forever. Your body is changed forever. You keep your baby forever. Your family is a family forever, right? So for me, I think it's a false expectation, because where we already live in a country that has a lot of pressure and has a lot of accolades and has a lot of deadlines and timelines, I personally think we are setting parents up for failure by putting all these mile markers in, right? And then when we look at postpartum, like when people ask me these things, I address it. I don't teach like 4-week sleep regression and 6-week this and blah, blah, because I'm like, you're not a textbook. Right. You're not a textbook. And yes, studies and research are very important and are needed. However, like every single person is a person and every single baby is a baby. And I think I can really credit that to a lot of like my teaching days, right? Because every mom, oh my God, my baby's 6 months old and they're not sitting up or they're not crawling or they're not this. And then, right, the comparison from multiple families. Well, my first did this and my first did that. And I'm like, this isn't your first, right? This is baby number 2, or this is baby number 3, or my sister this, my sister that, my friend so-and-so, right?
Oh yeah.
The groups we have, while I think that peer support is imperative and is really needed, and we got to keep talking and we got to keep sharing, and people deserve to have their space, right? You have to look at what your resources are in postpartum. I talk to parents a lot about, are their parents, are their friends, are their siblings sources of comfort, or are they sources of anxiety? If you have a mother or a mother-in-law that makes you very anxious and, right, is very, let's say, type A, and you know that that's not what you want in your postpartum experience, I'm like, then your mom needs to be on meal duty, right? Your mom knows when breakfast, lunch, and dinner is. She does not need to be coming over to help you bathe and to get your baby in the sunlight and to go for a little walk, because that's might not work today. So, the fourth trimester, and again, I have a client right now who just said to me, she's 4 weeks postpartum, and she honestly said to me bold-faced, can I go for a walk yet? And I was like, yeah, what are you, are your legs hurting? Did something, and she was like, no, my OB said I couldn't do any exercise until 6 weeks.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, that's not how that works.
Yeah.
And I was
so
like,
much permitting culture,
Right.
culture. Like we think we're not allowed to do things because there's such power in when a care provider says something. But then on the other hand, there's sometimes people who say a care provider says something and the person's like, well, I'm not going to listen to what they have to say. It's so interesting.
Well, part of it is, I mean, the postpartum brain is one that takes things very concretely too, right? I'm sure you find this, Jeanette, in your work as a lactation consultant. You have to be really careful the way you phrase things to new parents because their brain is in such a heightened state of needing to learn and sponge everything in, right? That if that OB said, I don't want you to exercise for 6 weeks, what he meant was, I don't want you to do abdominal sit-ups and run your marathon training and do the Peloton bike, right? He didn't mean go for a walk around the block. So the problem though is that our modern American culture is removing new families from their village, like you've talked so eloquently about, Arlene, right? That if you don't have someone in your family that's taking care of you as the parent, or a postpartum doula, which is so much more than just a babysitter. A postpartum doula is not just a babysitter. They are so a million times more than that. To say, no, let's talk about what that really means, right? Let's go for a walk today. This is how you can have a healthy recovery. This is how you can eat healthy. This is how you can bond in a healthy way. Like, to really kind of take that advice and, like you said, tailor it to the needs of that individual parent and that individual baby and what's best for them, right? Is so very important. So I really feel like everybody, well, Jenna and I are very pro doula.
I'm
We're
so
always like, get a doula, get a doula, get a. And I feel like more and more people are learning about birth doulas, which is great because they're awesome. But even more so, I feel like it's so hard to convince people like you need and deserve a postpartum doula.
I feel like the pandemic has made postpartum doulas more popular.
They have.
Which is so interesting because so many partners are home or have been home.
Interesting.
But still, I mean, I don't know that it's one-to-one, when you look at the people who are having that.
Thing to bring up though, and I think given my background and my cultural perspective and how I really see this work and my desire for birth work to be activism and to be something that is not politically charged. Like, I don't want people to think that I think birth is like taking back, something that has been just about systems. But there is political action in it, and there is a reclaiming of our birth because it's sacred and normal and natural, whether you have a belly birth, whether you have a medicated birth. All birth is natural, right? Like, that word is getting really ripped to shreds in a way that I don't particularly like. But in this conversation about postpartum and like the stigma, I have a lot of people have consults with me, right? And their first thing is like, well, do you do overnights? Because everyone says you don't sleep. And I'm like, whoa, who are you talking to? Who are you talking to? And that's not because I don't have children and I'm not sympathetic to the sleep deprivation of postpartum.
Sleep interruption, I like to call it.
Exactly. But because I am those things, I also realize that this is a full experience transformation, right? So there's, again, I think a lot of what is hurting our new parents is expectations and is storytelling and narratives. When I am in a consultation and like, if clients tell me that one partner has to go back to work, so their sleep has to be protected, I get that. I get that. And, I want to say to people who don't know anything about postpartum doulas, like, I'm not here to be all up in your marriage or your partner. Like, I'm not here to tell you like your partner's not doing enough. That's not the point at all. But again, it's the expectations and the planning, right? I've had clients who've done all the things, read all the books, taken all the classes, done all the studying, asked everyone, and still say to me, I could have never imagined that this is what it would be.
Yeah.
And I'm like, right, because you didn't know your baby,
right?
You didn't know your postpartum body, and you didn't know what those two things would do to other people in your bubble. And I think to your point, Jeanette, like, the pandemic is showing us, right? I know for better or worse, people are seeing really, really different sides of their partners, their kids, their support, their village, and are being tested, right? Like, everyone has different comfort levels around what works.
Yeah.
And so you gotta have people in your corner who are familiar with this. I mean, one of the first things I do, I teach parents to baby wear, because I'm like,
yeah.
first of all, save your arms.
Yeah.
Save your arms. Second of all, you have to have mobility. Like, you have to be able to get yourself a snack. You have to be able to take a cup out of the dishwasher. You have to be able, right? And I think that instead of all this unsolicited advice about telling parents not to hold their babies, or only to hold their babies, or put them in a basket, right? We have to teach people how to live their lives with a baby.
Teach people how to live their lives with a baby. Yes. Thank you. Amen. Because it's not that this baby is just plopped into the
That's
life.
a great tagline for a
have.
postpartum doula.
I love it. Market it.
That's good.
Right? And I think to go further than as an educator, and then teach your baby to be a part of your family. Teach your baby to be a part of your family. I spend a lot of time in conversations with parents, right? Or partners who are like, I'm just nervous because I don't feel like I'm allowed to do what I was used to allowed to do. Because my wife or partner doesn't want to do these things anymore because of the baby, right? Like, I have to ask to turn on the TV, or I have to ask to, or like, is the baby napping? And I'm like, listen, this is not sustainable.
Right.
This is
Make some
not
noise. Make some noise.
Make some noise.
I'm
Open
always
a
like, somebody
script.
told me, so I'll tell you. Like, what if you had 8 kids?
Well, that's the thing. People don't learn that
Gosh.
lesson sometimes, and oftentimes, until they have more than one. Because
Yeah.
while you can dote on your first, and not to say that you're not supposed to meet your baby's needs and listen to your baby, and I did, a lot of that with my kids, just following what their lead. But when the people who are like, my baby's perfect because he sleeps on a schedule and and I have it down to a science. Well, when you have your second, honey, and you have to bring your first to, daycare or preschool or this, that, get your kid off the bus, and this
It's gonna be a very different experience with that baby.
You're gonna have the naps are gonna be in the car and in a carrier. That's the only way. It's not gonna be a crib nap unless you're literally never gonna leave the house. Like,
again, I think, right, giving babies some credit. Our culture, Americans, we view the word infantile. We view babies as less than. Honestly, we really do. We treat infants as being inferior because we think they can't. And there's a big misunderstanding, which is why that's why I got so involved in infant development when I was a teacher, and I kept taking more classes, and I was like, no, this is a misunderstanding. Because even, and again, this is like not to highlight systems, but like, to be a certified teacher in Massachusetts, right? Like, you take the certain courses, you have your training, you work in a facility, and then you have continuing education. Your continuing education can go in a variety of places. And I chose to continuously infant development because I was like, there's so much conversation around what babies can and cannot do. And we're not talking about like their brains and their development and what's typical and normal versus abnormal for human development, right? The psychology behind this. I think that is something in postpartum that would actually alleviate some of this anxiety and fear and worrying that people have, right? I was at a visit a couple weeks ago where a dad said to me, they were talking about having the baby sleep in their crib versus like co-sleeping. And he said, well, during the day he naps really well in here. And he was like, but I think he wants to roll over, but he hasn't yet. So sometimes I just like do a little, and I was like, I'm gonna stop you right there.
Yeah.
And I was like, not because I'm here to judge, and not because I'm telling you you're doing something wrong. Your baby will roll. He will roll over. You don't need to rush him. And for me, right, like, taking a super serious like background of like, the state says your baby can't sleep like this, and muddling it down to not about can't, but like doesn't need to yet. Doesn't need to yet. If he's not rolling, then he's not rolling. And appreciate this time, because once he starts rolling, he's moving. Right?
It's gonna be from here to there. One of my kids that's how they got around. They would just
right. Yeah.
And so, right, like, there's such a large conversation here about like savoring moments, understanding development, being where your baby is, right? And then also like being okay yourself. And so, that's a conversation, like co-sleeping. is a word that has just been muddled and like bulleted in American culture. And honestly, because it's poorly depicted, right? And as the like most industrialized nation in the world, we don't look at what other nations are doing that are actually superseding our rate.
Absolutely.
So like we have this big thing about SIDS in this country, but we suffer from SIDS the most. Why is that? Right? There's a lot of miseducation. There's a lot.
That's a whole other topic. Goodness gracious.
We should have you back and talk about that.
Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by the stigma of birth?
Yeah. Ooh, okay. So kind of two things. I mean, specifically when I'm talking about for Black people and for Black birthers, the stigma of birth is complicated. I mean, I think there's a stigma, particularly from the medical industrial complex, the stigma that birth and pregnancy is a problem, is a disability, is something to be managed, right? So particularly as we were talking about earlier, like obstetrical versus midwifery care. I really think that most obstetrical violence comes out of a perception that birth is a problem. Birth is something happening at you. Giving birth is something to be managed. Like
in our country, it's more dangerous. And talk more about like how the statistics, because not everybody listening may know this. When you say that Black mortality is higher, can you share more about that when it comes to birth?
So unfortunately, the rates are even higher than they have been. You know, a lot of people right now are saying 2 to 3 times. It's really 3 to 4 times. Black women and Black people giving birth in the United States and America in 2021 are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or from childbirth complications.
And I've heard in New York City, it's 8 to 12 times higher.
It is. New York City has some of the worst rates and the highest counts of obstetrical violence.
And this is because of systemic racism.
It is.
It is not because of anything racial. It is not something inherent in low income or the color of your skin. And it's been researched over and over. And I remember learning about this 25 years ago when I was in graduate school for public health. And it's flooring to me. And then I worked at the State Department of Public Health. And I remember one day I went to the to one of these meetings about this topic. And I'm like, that was 20 years ago. How is this still happening? And then we have even now more of an awareness in popular, that's the wrong word, but popular culture, but like in the news, of so much horrible things happening. And it's still a problem. It's fascinating.
Something that was shocking for me, it's not funny, but it's ironic. I actually, on Facebook shows you your memories. I posted like 7 years ago an article about Black maternal mortality rate. And that at the time they were 2 to 3 times higher for Black women. Something that was shocking for me was when I went to my doula training in 2019, Shafia Monroe, who is like a pioneer in Black doula training, is a midwife. She talked about and was very explicit and showed us research that it is systemic racism, and it's not always the factors that you mentioned, Jeanette, that the more educated you are as a Black woman, you actually are at higher risk of complications. And the perceived mistrust and not knowing and not listening, because typically, as the research has shown, right, people who are of higher socioeconomic status, higher post-secondary education status, right, are more likely to birth in locations with higher accredited or accoladed institutions, and are therefore more likely to be that much further separated from their cultural and personal identity and receive worse care.
Yeah. And we are certainly not expecting you to speak for all Black people or all Black families. And your experiences your family experiences are unique to your family. However, something that really did strike me when you were speaking was when you said your father said, "This is the first premature baby we've ever had in our family." And this is something I want every white person listening to this show to understand, because especially if you were in nursing school or medical school, medical assistant training. I know I only graduated from nursing school in 2006. I understand that's like 15 years ago now, which kind of makes me cringe, but it wasn't that long ago. And when I graduated from nursing school, we were taught, as is still taught, this is what's very, as is still taught in nursing and medical schools, that race is a factor for morbidity and mortality, that a person's race, being Black, is a risk factor for hypertension. Being Black is a risk factor for diabetes. Being Black is a risk factor for premature delivery or preeclampsia or stillbirth or miscarriage or whatever. But it's actually not being Black.
I remember studying this. Racism. If you go to other countries where the population there, so I lived in West Africa for a couple of years, like that stuff doesn't happen there. Or I've seen studies where people from Haiti, for example, we have a lot of Haitians in Worcester, and there's a lot of infant mortality in particular as well. So where Haitians will be in Haiti and things will be fine, and then they come here and immediately, even the same person. So it's not even like they lived here for a generation, ate gross American food, and all of a sudden like their body didn't work the same way. Asians as well. They, it's not like they came here and totally changed their diet and messed up. Like even the same person who grew up in Asia then came here, then will have problems that they wouldn't have. It's insane.
Yeah. I think, just on a personal note, and I don't want to lead us off the topic of maternal care, but I feel very comfortable to share, given my family history. My mother died of breast cancer in 2010, and her OB that delivered me 17 years prior was the OB that said, yes, I think you have a lump. You need to go see an oncologist. And I think about that every single day. I think about it every single day. And I think about, it's really easy to tell you all the things I have experienced as a Black person in America and what I've seen my dad go through. The care that I saw my mother have around breast cancer that we're talking about all the time. 1 in 8 women in America will experience breast cancer.
October, go pink for breast cancer. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that for me so clearly mirrors the Black maternal mortality rates and the understanding, or the lack of, as you said, Melissa, like what doctors and providers and nurses and hospitals think about and say and practice for Black families. I remember going to Dana-Farber when my mom was admitted one time, and she had a friend visiting, and the nurse came in and said, "Oh, well, your family's here."
Oh, Jesus.
And I was 16.
And you were what?
I was 16. And I was like, oh, you don't think people come visit their family when they have cancer?
Right.
Or you think Black people don't have families?
Or if someone's Black, they're automatically their family.
Also that.
Right. That's the first thing I thought was that she thought that.
Well, and then to mirror that to births, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've had many nurses ask me, "Are you her sister?
Sure.
Are you her friend?" No, which is why I wear my doula shirt to every.
Now, just as the comparison, I was a doula for a long time, and I was, I think, only one time asked if I was a sister, and I went to about 120 births. Like it's just never assumed. Like you're just assumed to be the doula.
Right.
It's crazy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And the more identities you stack on top of each other, right? You talk about intersectional feminism, right? Like, so the woman in the room's never assumed to be the doctor. She's always assumed to be the nurse, right? The Black person in the room isn't assumed to be the nurse. They're assumed to be the medical assistant. And it's like, it's just all these, little microaggressions that really pile up the more identities you hold, queer, whatever. It's something that it's just frightening to me, the fact that you even had to say, Jeanette, because I've been doing this work for a long time. There might be some of our listeners who don't know the maternal mortality statistics for Black Americans is actually like enraging.
So Arlene, are the numbers, I mean, I would assume, but I just want to see, because you probably know, are the numbers in breast cancer, are they mirroring that, in that you're saying that Black women with or people of color with breast cancer are more likely to pass away than white people with cancer?
I'm not sure about the death rate, but I do know that Black women are diagnosed at later stages.
Sure. Oh, right. I have heard that. Right.
I know that.
Yeah.
Which, right, as we were
Sure.
talking about, like the medical industrial complex, like that simply comes down to not listening, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
for those of us who are familiar with cancer at all, a lot of times once you have found a lump, especially in breast cancer, like that is late stage. So there are many other factors that are screened for cancer, right? And again, when we're talking about women's health, and this is why like I feel so passionately about it, taking away race, right? And just looking at the medical industrial complex, like, well, what are our screenings for cancer and for women's health, right? We have to have mammograms. My dad has been adamant with my sister and I. You need to have mammograms. You need to have mammograms. And I'm like, call my insurance because they don't cover it before 40. Now I have history and family. I have a direct link. So I get covered at 35. But we know that there are women who have cancer before 35, right? And again, like that's only one tool. But I think, yeah, in this conversation about birth, and what we're experiencing and in the pandemic as well, right? We've seen a rise in, I think, rates of doulas, a rise in rates of home birth, a rise in rates of midwifery care, which is all great, even if for really unfortunate, hard reasons.
Yeah, no, you're right. And one last thing I'd like to talk about, because I love highlighting what makes you really special as a doula, Arlene, is that you know, when we talk about Black maternal health and midwifery, we are unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into the racial history of all of that. But a quick summary is that midwifery in this country was established by Black slave women and immigrants, and then was completely eradicated by a white male dominated obstetrical profession that needed to justify their existence by demonizing you know, these grand midwives who, and like you said earlier, Arlene, in just one generation, so much can be lost, right? If you silence all of those voices. So one thing that makes you special as a doula is that you have a keen appreciation, not only for, you know, postpartum care and honoring that time, but that you do some things that center around traditional African American midwifery practices. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I feel like, you know, Black women in this country are, and Black birth givers are deserving of culturally competent care when possible from Black providers that understand their experience on a much deeper level than Jeanette or I can understand it. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I want to also say, like, for listeners who maybe live in the area, this is something that for me, was very resounding to learn this, and felt very nurturing because it aligned with my own culture and my parents' Caribbean background. But like, there is a lot of, I think, regionalism in the US, right? And so this was something that to me became clear was part of like Black American identity that I hadn't really experienced because my parents aren't American.
Sure.
And so that to me felt really important too. A lot of the postpartum care, yes, revolves around mothering the mother. And so, you know, I mean, most of what I could say right now would be a quote to Shafia Monroe, but really this truly maternal centered care, right? And mothering the person. And that one thing in particular would be, you know, in perinatal experience of not having a baby shower, but having a mother shower, or what in some cultures would be called a blessing way, right? And that this is a really sacred, traditional time for women and for the birthing person, and for there to be celebration about the body and the experience and the transformation of pregnancy. And that we all know, hopefully, there will be a baby, and the baby will be loved and celebrated for the next 18, 20 plus years, right? And there's all the time to buy onesies and bring gifts. This is about the person having the baby right now. And so some of that looks, you know, like really wrapping her belly and decorating it and giving her a massage and making oils and bringing herbs for postpartum healing, right? And talking about foods and recipes that are ideal for recovery, and sitting in community, like with other birthers, with other women, with other sisters, with other people that you know and love who care about you and also knew you before you become a mother or a parent, right? And there's that whole conversation. And I think that's where a lot of what I was talking about, this miseducation, this misinformation, that's when that happens, is in those traditional community events where people come and celebrate you and bless you. And, you know, I don't want people to think that this is a religious thing. It's not. Like, we're not sitting and necessarily saying, like, hold hands and pray. Some people do that, but that's not what I would necessarily like consider to be the showering, right? But just that word, the showering of the mother or the birther, and telling stories and giving advice that's solicited and welcoming and warm, right? And so that this is not a time, and especially, right, if you looked at this in a very traditional sense, right? Say there was a woman who was going to have a shower and it was maybe hosted by her mother or her mother-in-law and, you know, and or her sisters, right? They would be gatekeepers in a sense of how doulas are. Or like if your doula threw this shower for you, right? They would be a gatekeeper of maintaining the peace. We're not here to tell trauma. This isn't a time for the bath, like the bloodbath stories. This isn't a time to talk about the perineum tearing, right? This is a time for support, for healing, for uplifting, for talking about the joy, all the beauty that's to come. And really, again, preparing the person for this like grand transformation. You know, we as doulas and nurses and midwives and doctors, we talk about when people are in labor, the transition phase, right?
Right.
And that like that time that is very difficult and is really, really hard for the person giving birth. But I think as a gatekeeper, as a birth keeper, as a witness is like one of the most really beautiful times of birth. And certainly if you're a person who's into birth, that's what you know, right? Like if you think that's beautiful and worth witnessing, you're a birth keeping person.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
It's an outer body experience for many. I know it was for me. I honestly can remember seeing myself in the water birth tub. Like, even though I was the one in the tub. Like,
I feel like transition is the moment that you really get it, that you're about to have another person. And even the concept of breaking into, which is not the right way to word it, right? But like you're literally becoming another, like you're splitting into another person too. Like you're becoming two people. And it's intense. It's a big, important process. And so having this community around you to talk about that and to say, we're here for you. And it's not all about the gifts and useless presents.
Right. And then in postpartum, we connect that, right? You come back from being two to being one, right? The mother baby or the parent baby is a unit. And again, I think part of what I really like to talk about, you know, in my own business, I say that my mission is to build a bridge between traditional, like very holistic, midwifery centered, maternal centered perinatal care and the modern world, right? Like it's 2021. I'm a millennial. I happily admit that. And I will say like a liberal Bostonian, happy to say that. So there's room, right? Like I don't want people to think that it's like, oh, everything is like sit and hold hands and kumbaya. Like I get that we are all living in a modern world. However, like I do think that pregnancy and birth is one of, if not the most spectacular events in life. And so if we don't slow down,
If we could get everybody to feel that way again, we'd change the world.
right. And so like talking about, you know, traditional African American midwifery care, just because I want to make sure I answer your question, like, I could clearly talk about
because I could listen to you all day, Arlene.
You know, in postpartum then is so centered on that healing and that uplifting and building confidence in the empowerment of the parents as a new family unit, as now, right, you're a new bubble in your community. You're no longer one person, you're a person with a baby, you're a family with a baby, and what that means. And so, with healing, right? Talking about herbs, and something I was like so appreciative in my training was like some of the things that I think now has become doula care then relates back to my own cultural upbringing. So like my grandmother was giving me sitz baths when I was 5, not because I was recovering from postpartum, but because I had a vulva, and talked to me about vulva care, right? Even just, I know, Melissa, you're a nurse. Like douching was something that I was told not to do very young.
Thank God.
So
good. Yep.
right. And so like even that conversation in postpartum, right? Like supporting, I think, what has been culturally conditioned for people, right? That you want to feel like yourself again, or you want to look like yourself again, or you want your body to do what it did before. And as your doula, I'm there every single moment of those thoughts to say, you're not supposed to. You're not that person anymore. And that's really okay. And actually, it's special and it's beautiful. And there's a lot of really great things about it. And like now you're somebody's parent, right? Now you're the source. You've become the source. And so, how do we maintain the bliss? How do we create a bubble? How do we make your home a nest, a nook, right? And not also resent postpartum. Like I give all my clients, I think it's actually Earth Mama, the brand, they have a lying in plan, which is so wonderful because it is a literal step-by-step piece of paper that says like, here's how to support your postpartum recovery and not get out of bed. And again, it's 2021. So I tell people like, take this with a grain of salt. I'm not saying you have to be, if you're not into Ayurveda health, no, you don't have to be in bed for the next 40 days.
Right. And not wash your hair.
Right. If you
but in some cultures, that's lovely. And that's what they want to do.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But I remember reading a book of a woman, I believe she's from China. I'll have to look it up and put it in the show notes. But her mother was very adamant that she did this traditional Chinese, like 30-day lying in period where she wasn't allowed to wash her hair. And she really wanted to do it because she believed in it. And she said she made it to like day 21, and then she's like, okay, Mom, I at least have to wash my hair, like because we are modern families. We can marry them, right? Yeah. Like it doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be that you don't bathe for 40 days. Like my grandmother, in her episode, was talking about how her mother never wanted her to take a bath, right? And couldn't even put her hands in the water when she was menstruating. And like there's got to be a happy medium. We can. That doulas are a wonderful bridge. In fact, doulas are a bridge. I'm trademarking that.
Yes. and I just want to say quickly too, like especially for listeners, right? Like I'm very open about, of course, like me being Black and these being Black centered stories and traditions, but they're not just for Black people. Because of the mortality rates, because of systemic racism, because of this highly conditioned and prejudiced world we live in, I want people to know where it comes from. But I don't say that to mean like you can't do this if you're not Black. Some of my clients are Black, some of them are not. I have white clients, I have Indian clients, I have Asian clients. And again, for those who identify as women and understand their womanhood or their femininity, if that's what they're looking for, that's what I'm speaking to. And so like this transcends culture and time, right? And I think that there's a beauty in the history of the traditions that we have lost, like I was talking about before, because in one generation, right? Like these are things that I'm going to have to write down to tell.
Oh, I think you should have a TED Talk.
I think you should have a TED Talk, and I think you should write a book.
We have plans for you.
Please write them down.
I know. It should be written down. And so, and again, I think that is something I learned in doula culture of learning from midwives, from learning from grand midwives, right? And I say to all of my clients now, I just said it to my sister the other day. I was like, you should really call Auntie and ask her about this. I could tell you the answer, but you should call her. And I say to all my clients, if you have a relationship with your elders, if you have a relationship with siblings, with aunties, with right, and again, the women who didn't have babies, but who have been around babies, ask them, talk to them, because they have stories and they have so much wisdom and knowledge that don't come from textbooks, that aren't on Facebook, that don't cost $29.99 on Amazon, right? And it is so powerful, so powerful. And I think that a lot of what people experience in becoming parents, right, is actually unlearning a lot of conditioning that we've had. And so, right, it's this like whole psychological process of like, now you've made a new person, you're one with the person, then you separate from the person, now you unlearn who you've become, and now you step into the light of a new right? Like, how mind-boggling.
It's a mind fuck. I'm gonna say it. It really is.
It's
the
hard.
vulnerability of new parenthood is something that you cannot be prepared for. Like you just outlined it so perfectly.
Yes. So this is officially going to be a 2-episode episode.
Oh, it has to be because.
And Arlene, I want to give you big props as we close to being the guest that said vulva the most.
Yes. I love it. I love it.
I'm so proud to have that title. That the teacher in me is like, I got a gold star for the day.
You did. So thank you so much for coming on our show today and sharing your expertise and experiences and all these cool things about your family and culture. If everybody listening would like to learn more about Arlene and her birth work and postpartum work, you can go to newwavedoula.com. Follow her on Instagram at newwave_doula. And we're thrilled that she's joined the ranks of exceptional birth workers and birth workers of color in Massachusetts. And we hope you find yourself really busy for the rest of 2021, Arlene, and get some help from having this podcast, I hope, highlight the fact that you're out there and so awesome. So thank you for being here.
I'm so grateful. It was an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it. And it's been such a joy. Thank you so much for having me. Truly.
Yes, thank you, Arlene. I mean it. I had to cut off our conversation when we first spoke because I had to go to the chiropractor, but I could have listened to you all night then too. And tonight I could too. So when your TED Talk is published, we'll put it on, we'll share it on Babies in Common Facebook page. When your book is published, we'll share it on our Babies in Common Facebook page. And we hope that all of you will tune in again to our show, because Babies in Common is a community for you. After all, we all have
babies in common.
Thanks, Arlene.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, guys.